What is the origin of the Hong Kong protest? What is the real dissatisfaction of the protesters? Let's find out together. After the 10 weeks long of the street protesting in Hong Kong, a lot of things happened and people around the world turned their focus point to them. So, what's really happening in Hong Kong? And right now I'm here at Chulalongkorn University going to talk to Assistant Professor Dr. Wasana Wongsurawat, the lecturer of the Faculty of Arts. So, let's go to talk to her about the situation. What is the origin of the protest and what is the real dissatisfaction of the protester?
Well, as you probably heard from the news, protesters started out opposing the passing of the extradition law that supposedly would allow people to be extradited from Hong Kong to be extradited to Beijing to face trial in the PRC. So that was the beginning, the origin of the protests. But as time passed, the Hong Kong government used force to try to pacify the protesters, and there's rhetoric like calling the protesters rioters and such, and the refusal of the chief executive Carrie Lam to resign from her position, that has caused dissatisfaction among protesters and therefore led to a protracted weekly protest, as you know, up to 10 weeks already, and the level of violence from both sides appears to be escalating over time. So right now we have further requests, further demands that include universal suffrage or a more democratic system of electing members of the Hong Kong government and the chief executive.
Based on your opinion, what's the best solution of this problem and what's going to be happened in the future?
I think it's very difficult for Beijing to deal with this situation because on the one hand, no one wants Hong Kong to become a war zone, right? No one wants Hong Kong to be infused with tear gas and everything. No one wants bloodshed because it's bad for business. And when business is bad in Hong Kong, it's also bad for the economy, and it hurts the Chinese economy as well. And the Chinese reputation and all that is all in this. So we don't want this to happen. No one wants this to happen.
Yep.
But at the same time, I think Beijing also, or the chief executive Carrie Lam, doesn't want to look like a softie, or they don't want to send the message to the protesters that if you protest in such a way, if you use violence, if you vandalize the parliament and all that, then you would get what you want. Yeah. So that's difficult, right? But at the same time, if they don't give in at all, then the protesters feel like we've come out, in the millions and still nothing happens. We're not going to get anything from peaceful protesting. Yep. So this is getting to a difficult point, and I think that there is still hope for this to be resolved peacefully. I think it would be naive and overly optimistic to expect that Beijing would allow the complete democratization of Hong Kong. I don't think that would happen. But at the same time, I think there are many demands. There are some demands that could be met without changing the structure too much. And I think if eventually the government can come can grant some of those demands to the protesters, it would ease the tension a bit. Because as if you were in the discussion that we just had, you'd see that a lot of protesters don't believe in using violence. So it's not that all the protesters agree on the use of violence or the seize of the airport or the vandalizing of the parliament or things like that. So this is the part where they disagree, and I think this is also a point where maybe if the government is more willing to negotiate, we can settle this peacefully. Yes.
What is the worst case in your opinion?
I don't like to think of worst case. It's already, we already see things that we would like to be worst case, and then think it gets even worse, right? So
think of the worst.
So I mean, think
Worst of the worst.
something like firing a tear gas canister into the underground station, for example, is something that I would never have imagined to see happening in Hong Kong, for example, or the level of violence that we see in the internet, some of the level of violence that we see in the international media. And also, I would never have imagined that Hong Kong demonstrators would take siege of the parliament and vandalize things. It started out being a demonstration that, people say we're not going to break a pane of glass in the malls, right? So this has come so much further than what we have always hoped to be the worst case, right? Of course, we have situations looming in the back of our minds. We have the idea of, this time, this demonstration has become much more violent than it used to be in the umbrella revolution just a couple of years ago. So now it's more violent than then, right? But then we have other points of reference, like maybe is it going to be like the Arab Spring? Is it going to be like Tunisia? Is it going to be like Tiananmen in 1989? It's so we can keep thinking about, to the very end, like is it going to blow up like Syria, right? So I mean, if you're a historian, the possibilities are endless. So I think we probably don't want to think of the worst case.
The protester has been protesting for more than 10 weeks, right? Mm-hmm. So could you tell me, or in your opinion, do you think, are there anyone supporting them secretly or not secretly?
Yes, I mean, it's very clear. You have businesses and you have organizations that allow their people to go on strike, right? There was a general strike on one of the Mondays, for example. So obviously there's some businesses that support this. You have some civil society organizations that are involved in this. And it's difficult to say if there's foreign support or not, because I know that's what you're getting at. Because Hong Kong is an international economic and financial hub, right? So it's very difficult to separate the domestic and the international in Hong Kong, right? Because you have all these foreigners, foreign companies, foreign money, and you also have the aspect of the Chinese diaspora, right? What about the Hong Kong population that migrated overseas, right? Do you count them as domestic or international? What about other pro-democracy groups in other countries, right? And to be fair, like if you're a foreigner, if you just want to go to Hong Kong to eat good dim sum, right? And you go to the airport, right? There are demonstrators all over the place, right? You go into the mall, you're going to run into demonstrators if you go during the weekend. So I think it's very possible that there can be support from outside of the country, but then at the same time, right? How do you differentiate the domestic from the international in a city like Hong Kong, where everyone is so internationalized, right? And so much of the business there is internationalized, and so many expats are there, so many foreigners are there. So yeah, but you definitely can't have a demonstration at such a scale without financial support from someone, right? But I think it's impossible to say, like you probably cannot prove that like the U.S. government is behind this, right? And it's so I don't think you can differentiate things in that way, in that sense.
How Chinese government react to the protest, and how long that they will let this happen?
This is also very difficult because from my point of view, and I might be wrong, but
Yeah.
from my point of view, I think it's impossible to say exactly what comes from Carrie Lam and the Hong Kong government and what comes from Beijing, right? Because the police force that has been used so far it's theoretically is under the Hong Kong government, right? So there is no proof and there is no way for me to know at this point how much of it is directed by Beijing, right? So it would be unfair to Beijing to say that Beijing does this, that, the other thing. But at the same time, Beijing has presented its standpoint quite clearly in this case, and so we know where Beijing stands as opposed to the government, the governing system in Hong Kong, the selection of the chief executive, the rule of law in Hong Kong, and but in terms of the level of violence that is being used, I would say that is still unclear whether it's Beijing or it's Carrie Lam or it's the Hong Kong government as a whole. Yeah.
At what point do you think that the Chinese government will use the military force with the protesters?
I think, and once again, I really can't speak for the Chinese government, but I think they would avoid it at all costs. I think it's the absolute last resort. But at the same time, they cannot pull it off the table completely. It has to be there for deterrence. It has to be there, that the possibility has to be there so that maybe the demonstrators would think twice. So they would never come out and say, you can be 150% sure that we're not going to use force. The Beijing government is never going to do that. So the possibility is always going to be there, but I think the use of the military in this case would be very damaging for the People's Republic of China as a whole, and it would be bad for the Chinese economy as well. So no one wants to use force. So I think it would be the absolute last resort, yes.